1979 through November of 1984. It took him 5 years to deliver this material once a week at an audience. He gave this teaching at the Vatican. In the teaching, he asserts that the human body is not only biological, but it's theological. Theological means it tells us something about God. So it speaks, he said, to the purpose of human existence, which is to be a physical image of God. This is his thesis. Okay, this is what John Paul II said about the human body. This is kind of difficult, but we're going to take it a little bit at a time. The body, and in fact, only the body, is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and the divine. Only the body. It has been created to transfer into visible reality of the world that we live in the mystery hidden from eternity in God, and thus to be a sign of it. So, what is he saying here? He's saying that it is our body, and in fact, only our body, that can actually teach about God in this material world. It is the body that does the best job of imaging God to a material world. This has a lot to do with why God might have seen it necessary to come into our world with a body. Okay? Because, as John Paul points out, only the body can make that reality visible to people in a body for us to really understand. That's pretty deep. Before we get into John Paul's teaching, let's just reflect for a minute. How do you view your body? I don't expect you to actually answer these questions out loud, but I do want you to think about it. Be honest. How do you really think about your body? Most of us have grown up with some, at least, conflict about the way that we think about our body. Do you think that your perception of your body and what you do with your body affects your relationship with God? Father Tim sort of set this up pretty nicely in the homily today, talking about that call to holiness that we know has a lot to do with what we do with our body. Does what you do with your body affect your ability to live a holy life? This is exactly what Father Tim was talking about in the homily today. It's not advancing, is it? We're stuck. It didn't even put it in pieces. I didn't notice. It was a lot easier when there was like a cable.
Yeah. Disconnected from it.
Let's see if it'll go now. Okay, so let's back up to, that's his thesis. So only the body is capable of making the reality of God visible in this material universe. Only the body. And we'll see how he gets to that and fleshes out the teaching. So here are the questions. How do you view your body? Do you think that your perception of your body and what you do with it have an effect on your relationship with God? And does what you do with your body affect your ability to live a holy life? Given the fact that we're called to do that, as Father Tim pointed out in the homily today, we're all called to be holy. So, theology of the body is presented in three parts. Today, we're going to look at only the first part. But John Paul II talks about creation of the body, which is what we're going to focus on today. But he talks about redemption of the body, because as we said before in the preview, that humans failed at what God had intended with the body. And so therefore God had to redeem that. And he has done that through the passion of Jesus, right? And then the resurrection of the body. Okay, so these three parts are the fullness of the theology of the body teaching. But we're only going to focus on the beginning of it today as an introduction. So that part is called creation of the body. Now, this is how John Paul II got to his teaching. Primarily, creation of the body is an exegesis, which means an explanation of the first two chapters of Genesis. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the creation stories in order to look at this material today. But the way John Paul got to it started with Jesus, okay? It's found in Matthew chapter 19, and it's where the Pharisees asked Jesus a question about divorce, okay? So all of this teaching starts with a question asked to Jesus about divorce. And it was asked for the purpose of trapping Jesus and getting him in trouble with the religious authorities in his day. This is the question. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason whatsoever? That's Matthew 19:3, verse 3. Jesus' answer to that question was this: haven't you read that from the beginning, the Creator made them male and female? That was Jesus' answer to, can you divorce your wife? Doesn't exactly sound like an answer, does it? He didn't say no or yes. He said this. Now, John Paul II says, that's the next verse, right? Matthew 19:4. But John Paul says that Jesus said that because he was referencing chapter 1 of Genesis, the first creation story. In other words, the question of divorce calls up for Jesus the way God created humans and why he created them that way. And so that's what John Paul's going to focus on. A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That is Matthew 19:5, the next verse. So Jesus' answer, John Paul II says, this verse, or this part of his answer, calls up the second creation story. Okay, so in the two sentences that Jesus used to answer the Pharisees, he makes reference to the first two chapters of Genesis, according to John Paul II. Now, this may come as a surprise to you that there are actually two creation stories. Okay, but that's what John Paul II said. There's chapter 1 and there's chapter 2, and they're not the same. His teaching, not mine. So here they are. The two creation stories are not historical accounts. They're not attempts to tell exactly how God brought about the creation of the world. They're not scientific. They're literary studies of why humans were created that describe the theological and the psychological makeup of human beings. You know, this is important. So the stories are told to talk about the theological purpose of humans and the psychology of being human. Okay? Basically, the first story is theological, the second one is psychological. So we're going to look at that. Here's the first story, Genesis 1, a theological study of humanity. How so? In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Everybody knows that verse, right? The first verse of the Bible. And then what happened? In the beginning, he created the heavens and the earth. What does God then do? This is a real question. What does he do after that? He creates some more stuff, right? Like what?
Day, night.
Yes. Sun, the moon, matter, then fish, animals, right on up through the hierarchy of creation. But eventually we get to verse 27. So from 1 to 26, God makes a bunch of stuff. Light, water, separates the water from the land, then brings fish into the water. You remember the story, right? And after every day, so the poem, it's a poem, covers 6 days and then a seventh day. But in those 6 days, after every creation, after every day, what does God say about the creation? It is good, right? Y'all remember this. It's the first page of the Bible, right? God said it is good. So what we learn about God creation is it was created good. Now, that realization was the Hebrew response to the teachings of the other religions they were being exposed to, which taught that creation was a battle between good and evil, and that good put in some stuff and the dark side put in some other stuff. And that's why we see both good and evil in our world. It's kind of a logical teaching, but the Hebrew revelation from God said no. God created everything good. There was no bad. There was no not good in the way God created. But then in verse 27, what did he create? The last thing he created. What do you think? Huh? People, right? Yep. God created man, actually, that probably should say mankind, in his image. In the divine image, he created him. Male and female, he created them. This is still the first page of the Bible. Okay? This tells us a lot right here, says John Paul II. He says that this verse 27 of the first chapter of Genesis, tells us that humans are created in the image of God. Do you see that? In the divine image he created. What is an image? If I ask you what is an image, what would you say?
Picture.
A picture. That's a good answer. So an image is not the thing. It's a picture of the thing. Whatever the thing is. Okay? Here, the thing, if I could use that word, is God. Okay? The actual thing that we're talking about is God. And John Paul says that the scripture's telling us that humans are the picture of God, the image of God. We're supposed to be, we were created to be a picture of God. Do you see that? what does an image do? If it's a good image, it should reflect something about whatever it's an image of. If I look at an image and it doesn't tell me something true about you, then I would say this is a bad picture, right? She really has blonde hair and this is black. This is not her. Do you see my point? When we look at humans, we should see something about God. A rather scary thought. When people look at us, they should know something about God. Well, that means we have a purpose. And that purpose is to be a picture of God for the world. That's a pretty tall task. How do we do it? How do we image God? First of all, by being creative. Okay, so the whole first 26 verses of Genesis reveal to us about God that God is a creative being. Creation comes out of the nature of God. Do you see that? This is why human creativity is something that images God, because when we're being creative, we're doing what God did. This is why the church always has, in all its history, celebrated creativity. This is why music is important in the church. This is why poetry is important. This is why building beautiful buildings has always been important in the church, because it reflects the nature of God. That creativity is actually a means of imaging God. Does everybody see that? So the very first way that humans image God is by being creative beings. Other animals are not creative. They can't take an abstract idea and then make something real out of that idea. That's creativity. I think something up and I take notes and I produce a song. That's being creative. I make something tangible out of something intangible. Does that make sense? Even can be to, I have an idea to build a birdhouse, and I take wood and I make it into the birdhouse. That transference of spirit into a structured matter, using matter, in building something that is an idea and taking that and making something concrete. That's what we mean about being creative. That's what God did when he made the world. And that's why when we're creative, we image God. But here's the point John Paul is doing all of this to get to. The most profound way we image God is as a communion of persons. A communion of persons. A community of persons. In other words, not by ourselves, but in relationship. Okay, so in other words, John Paul is saying that we best image God as a communion of persons. Now, why would that be, do you think? Why would we best image God not just individually in our creativity, but more so in a communion of persons? The reason is because God is a communion of persons. God is not an individual. God is a relationship, right? That's why we worship the Trinity. That's why to be Christian is to worship the Trinity. Now, John Paul is saying that the reason why we best image God not as an individual is because God is not an individual. And in order to really image God properly, God created humanity as a communion of persons, not as a person. And he got that from verse 27 of chapter 1 of Genesis. You see that? He created them male and female. So what does that mean? Male and female. When the text uses that word, what is it focusing on? The body. How do you know a male from a female? By looking at their soul? No. You tell the difference between a male and a female by looking at their body. Okay, what part of their body? I bet you never heard a talk like this at church before, right? Yeah, you got to look at their genitals in order to tell the difference between a male and a female. So in verse 27 of chapter 1 of the Bible, God is focused on the human body and specifically between the difference between male and female. But in what way? God said, this is the very next verse, right? 128, said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. I call this the first commandment. This is the first thing God said to people in the Bible. What did he say? What does this mean? What is God telling them to do? Have babies. I bet you didn't learn that in Sunday school. The church gets a really bad rap about being against sex. Apparently not. It's the first thing God told people to do. Is it not? I'm not making this up, people. I'm reading it out the Bible. It's the first thing God said to do. Why? Why is this the first thing God told people to do? Obviously, the focus is on sexuality. Human sexuality, their fruitful sexuality, is how humans best image God. So it is in human sexuality. This is why human sexuality is holy. This is why the church has so many teachings about it, because it's the holiest thing, because it's the thing that most profoundly images God. Do you see why? Because in fruitful sexuality, two people join together in love, and that love rises to create a new person. You see that? What it was the crowning achievement of God's creation. That after God created them, he said, this is very good. Right? It's when he created humans. Then he turns around and gives us the power to do that, to create what only God can create. A human being. Do you see why it's holy? Because it images the peak perfection of God's creation, the creation of another human being. This is why there's so much focus on the sanctity of human sexuality in the church. Okay? Because it's right here on the very first page of the Bible. We haven't even gotten off the first page of the Bible to get all of this teaching. But we move on to the second creation story. Okay? So the first creation story ends in the first few verses of the second chapter, where God rests on the seventh day. Okay? But the focus for us was on the production of humans as a communion of persons, male and female specifically, so that they could come together to produce a human being, life, because that images God. So in the second creation story, which starts on about the 4th verse of the 2nd chapter, John Paul says that this is a psychological study of humanity. The first one was a theological study. In other words, it was telling us mostly about God. God's a communion of persons, not a person, right? We learn about the Trinity on the first page of the Bible. It's amazing. Even though the people that got that revelation didn't realize it, there it is on the very first page of the Bible. So let's look at the second story, because it's going to talk about, again, from a different perspective, how and why God created humans as he did. So in this, John Paul talks about 3 original states of creation. Mass is out? Okay. They're headed this way? Okay. You want them to go? You guys go get food.
And look, I know I put in the newsletter